Hi everyone, I'm Kelsey. Thanks for stopping by my channel and for joining me for another day of Vlogmas. Today I am going to talk about my biggest disappointments of the year. I am not going to do a worst books of the year list because I think reading is so subjective that I don't like the term worst necessarily for this list. So disappointment just feels like a better way to describe how I felt about a book, because ultimately every book I pick up, I want it to be a 5-star read. And ultimately, not every book will be a 5-star read, right? So every book that's not that is going to be disappointing or not what I expected in that manner. Like, we're all trying to read the best books we can read. So biggest disappointments feels like the best way to do this year. I have 9 books on my biggest disappointment list, and some are really popular, some are backlist. I kind of feel like I've read really broadly this year as far as front list, backlist, diversity, whatnot. So the very first book is Pappyland, and this is by Wright Thompson, and he's a sports writer. I got this book recommended to me by Fabled in one of their book previews, and one thing that I really like is food writing, and anything that kind of explains the history of food and drink is usually up my alley. So Pappyland is it's a story of family fine bourbon and the things that last. So I thought it was going to be more food writing on the family that created a certain brand of bourbon, and while it was, and more, I wanted it to be more history and food writing and more on this family. And it was more, instead it was like this journalist that kind of provided a little bit of history and family story behind this bourbon. So this book takes the Van Winkle family and their bourbon, and the head of the family, Julian, wants to preserve his bourbon. And I thought that it would be a much more interesting book than it was, because I thought it was going to be about how this guy was going to save his bourbon, and we get like the family backstory and all of that. But really, he invited this Wright Thompson into his life, and it was less about whiskey and bourbon making and more this like life lessons that Julian was teaching this journalist. It was just not what I thought it would be. A very short book, so it really didn't take a lot of time out of my life in reading it, but I just had this one expectation in how it was pitched, and then it was not that. It was just like, it was so weird. It was like life lessons from a bourbon distiller to this guy who's just a sports journalist writing about bourbon, and it just didn't work for me. The next book that was a disappointment for me was Before We Visit the Goddess by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. I love complicated family books. I love looking at a mother-daughter relationship, anything where we're diving into why a family is what a family is. And this book was pitched as the author exploring the complex relationships between mothers and daughters and the different kinds of love that bind us across generations. And this book is multi-generational, so it almost read like a series of essays and less of a novel. So you get one essay or one character story, and then you jump to this next character story, and then this next, and this next, as we went through the generations. And they loosely tied together, but they didn't. And I just was left very underwhelmed. I wanted more interweaving and seeing how these things kind of hashed out. And it was more of a look at kind of how like generational trauma plays out in each generation, but it didn't tie well together. So it was just disappointing, and it was something I thought I would love. It had all the makings to be a book that I would love. So another one that was extremely disappointing to me was Something Wilder by Christina Lauren. I have loved almost all of Christina Lauren's books. I feel like they've become so popular that now they can write whatever they want, and that's great. If I was those authors, I would 100% do the same thing. I thought this book was bananas. So it's about the main heroine. Her dad owns like a dude ranch and is a famous treasure hunter. And there's this treasure from his family that they think he's hidden, but it's kind of lore, kind of not. And the hero, he works at their dude ranch for a summer. They fall in love, and then he has to fly home and something happens and they disconnect. Fast forward so many years, he's on a bachelor party. His friend was just like, I'm gonna book this. and you guys can't ask questions. Lo and behold, he books it at the dude ranch that the heroine works at. And this book read like a bad Western movie. It was just bonkers. They were on this dude ranch going on these hikes and all this stuff, and all these things kept happening. There's a murder. There's just like all of this stuff in a romance novel that wasn't believable. And I just could not suspend my disbelief on this one. I read it super fast. It had that character of Christina Lawrence, so there was lots of banter. The sex scenes were pretty closed door. It just was so ridiculous. I couldn't deal. Another big disappointment for me this year was The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I had seen previews of the Netflix series, and the Netflix series took a lot of liberties with this small novella or novel. The book, yes, it's a haunted house, but it was also a psychological thriller, which I guess for the time it was pretty advanced for that time. I don't know. I just was very underwhelmed by that book and was disappointed in that I thought it'd be this ridiculous haunting, so scary, whatever, and really it was like psychological and just a letdown. I was bored, frankly. And then my book club, we read Gods in Alabama by Jocelyn Jackson. And I have read The Almost Sisters by her, and that was just like a quirky Southern fiction novel. And Jocelyn Jackson just has this voice that I do really like. I like her writing voice. For 10 years, Arlene has kept her promises, and God has kept his end of the bargain until now. When an old schoolmate from Posset turns up in Arlene's door in Chicago asking questions about Jim Beverly, former quarterback and god of Posset High, Arlene's break with her former hometown is forced to an end. At the same time, Burr, her longtime boyfriend, has raised an ultimatum. Introduce him to her family or consider him gone. Arlene loves him dearly, but knows her lily white, not to mention deeply racist, Southern Baptist family will not understand her relationship with an African-American boyfriend. Reluctantly, Arlene bows to the pressure, and she and Burr embark on a long-avoided road trip back home. As Arlene digs through guilt and deception, her patched-together alibi begins to unravel, and she discovers how far she will go for love and a chance at redemption. Okay, so a white lady wrote this book having a conversation about race. There were a lot of deeply racist things in here, and my book club read it, and we just all were very grossed out by it. It's an example of a book that did not age well, and it's not that old. It was published in 2005, but definitely hasn't aged with the time. There's just so many problematic elements to this book that I am almost embarrassed I read it, which is bad. I gave it 2 stars. It just was not good. There's a sex scene that is very questionable and not appropriate for what consent is. Like, there's just trigger warnings abound, but I don't feel like the author handled any of it with the fine, like, tooth comb that it needed. It did not age well. It was not appropriate. I do not recommend, and I'm very disappointed that this is what is in her backlist when her front list is something I truly enjoy. The next disappointing book that I read was for the Modern Mrs. Darcy book club. It was a pick earlier this year, and it's called The Unseen World by Liz Moore. Many people know Liz Moore because she wrote Long Bright River, which was super popular. I have not read it. This is about Ada Sebelius. She's raised by David, her brilliant, eccentric, socially inept single father who directs a computer science lab in 1980s era Boston. Homeschooled, Ada accompanies David to work every day. By 12, she is a painfully shy prodigy. The lab begins to gain acclaim at the same time that David's mysterious history comes into question. When his mind begins to falter, leaving Ada virtually an orphan, she's taken in by one of his colleagues. Soon she embarks on a mission to uncover her father's secrets, a process that carries her from childhood to adulthood. When Ada discovers on her journey into a virtual universe will keep the readers riveted until the unseen world's heart-stopping, fascinating conclusion. This book was neither riveting nor heart-stopping nor fascinating. It was boring. I liked the father-daughter dynamic, but then once it got to the point where David loses his mind and he has Alzheimer's or dementia, I cannot remember which one he has, but his mind is literally failing him. And the book just kind of unraveled, and there were a lot of plot twists and red herrings that didn't do anything for the story for me, and I just thought it was extremely boring for how it was explained and how the blurb made the book sound. So it just was such a letdown for me, and that made me sad because I know this author is well respected. I will say the writing was really good, so that was good for her, but it just didn't do it for me. One of my anticipated releases this year was Wild and Wicked Things by Francesca May. And this is in the aftermath of World War I, a naive woman is swept into a glittering world filled with dark magic, romance, and murder in this lush and decadent debut. This is how I was portrayed by this book. Magic, Great Gatsby era, queer. And that sounded really cool. It just wasn't that magical. And there were a lot of plot holes that I didn't understand what was happening, and things felt forced. And then there's just nothing tied together well, so that I ended up finishing the book with more questions than I had answers, and I didn't feel like I understood what had happened. Like, I truly did not understand the book, and the plot holes in this book were just so glaring that I didn't get anything from it. There was just so much, there wasn't enough world building to make what was happening make sense, and I felt like the author just kind of shoved a bunch of stuff into the book, didn't explain it, and you were just supposed to be cool with that, and I didn't like it. So the last two books are The Love of My Life by Rosie Walsh. I had read Ghosted by her, and that one had also fallen flat. This book is basically, so here's how it starts. I have held you at night for 10 years and I didn't even know your name. We have a child together, a dog, a house. Who are you? Emma loves her husband Leo and her young daughter Ruby. She'd do anything for them, but almost everything she's told them about herself is a lie. And she just might get away with it if it weren't for her husband's job. Leo's an obituary writer. Emma is a well-known marine biologist. When she suffers a serious illness, Leo copes by doing what he knows best, researching and writing about her life. But as he starts to research her, he discovers the woman he loves doesn't really exist. Even her name isn't real. When the very darkest moments of Emma's past finally emerge, she must somehow prove to Leo that she really is the woman he always thought she was. But first, she must tell him about the other love of her life. So I thought this was going to be more of like a suspense thriller. It was more a family drama. And I'm actually kind of conflicted in putting this in biggest disappointments, because a lot of the book, you're led to believe something about Emma that society wants you to believe. Then they turn it on your head and you figure out the truth. And I like how that was handled. So I'm an adoptive mom, and a lot of this book, there's a whole bunch of adoption in this. And the parts that I struggled with were where it played into the stereotypes of adoption that aren't correct, aren't appropriate, aren't healthy for adoptees. But then where it turns it on its head, they handle it really well. So I would love to sit down with Rosie Walsh and just talk to her about her experience, because I do think of all the fiction books I've ever read about adoption, I think this book is probably the best and has handled it the best. I think it's weird to put this one on my biggest disappointments, because it's disappointing because I thought it was going to be a thriller, and it was really just a family drama. That's why it was disappointing. But I want to say this handles the adoption stereotypes and what adoption actually is from like a birth mother's perspective and adoptee perspective better than any book I have ever read yet. So it's the biggest disappointment in that it wasn't what I expected it to be, but I will say that it did handle that extremely well, and that's not done very often in books. So I'm very like sensitive to that and touchy about it, and I will say it was just handled very well. Okay, and then my final disappointment is The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston. And I know how popular this book is, and I hate that it's a disappointment. I gave it 3 stars expecting it to be like a 5-star that I would just adore, because everybody loved it, and people that I love their reading taste loved it too. My problem is I read this really close to The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, which many of you know is one of my favorite books, and it will be talked about a ton throughout the series. But I think where I struggled was that book just did everything so much better in my opinion, and it was so quirky and weird and cute. Whereas this just kind of fell flat, and the plot twist at the end I was so annoyed by, because it just was dumb. And I thought like the main character was kind of mopey, and the family drama was just too much, especially having read Undertaking of Heart and Mercy and thinking like that family, I just love that dynamic. So this one was just a disappointment. It was 3 stars, which is still good for me, but it just didn't do much for me. And I will say, if you like The Dead Romantics, I totally would love to have you read The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, because I want to know your thoughts and see like how they compare if you were someone who loved that and then read this after, because I did it the other way around. So I'm curious about that. But those are my 9 disappointing books for the year, the ones that just didn't live up to what I wanted them to be. I would love to know if you've read any of them, and if you feel the same or different from me. I love hot takes in the comments. Feel free to leave them. But thank you so much for stopping by, and until the next round of Vlogmas, We'll see you then. Bye.